In the autumn of 1888, a shadow fell over the grimy streets of London's Whitechapel. It was a phantom of death that would give birth to a legend, and a name that still echoes through history: Jack the Ripper. This is the story of the 5 women who fell victim to his blade, the flawed investigation that failed to catch him, and the chilling mystery that haunts London to this day. To really get a grip on the terror Jack the Ripper unleashed, you first have to step into his world. The London of 1888 was a city of 2 halves. While one side glittered with progress and wealth, the East End, and specifically the district of Whitechapel, was a maze of poverty and despair. Overcrowded slums, called rookeries, were crammed together, their windows dark and their alleyways filled with filth and shadows. This was a place where thousands lived hand to mouth, where just getting through the day was a struggle. For women in poverty, the options were bleak, forcing many into the dangerous life of sex work. It was this vulnerability that a killer would exploit. Against this grim backdrop of social turmoil and anti-immigration sentiment, the murders began. The press, hungry for a sensational story, was ready to fan the flames of fear, turning both the squalor of Whitechapel and the gruesome crimes into a national obsession. The public was captivated and horrified. The stage was set for a moral panic, with vigilante groups roaming the streets and innocent men facing accusations from hysterical crowds at any moment. History remembers the killer, but it often forgets the victims. They were more than just names on a list. They were women whose lives were cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. The canonical 5 are the 5 victims most historians agree were killed by the same person. The terror began on August 31st, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was 43 years old. After a tough life marked by a failed marriage and a struggle with alcohol, she was just trying to get back on her feet. She was last seen on Osborne Street, telling a friend she'd soon have her DOS money from a client. Her body was discovered in the early morning hours in a dark gateway in Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut twice, and her abdomen had deep, vicious wounds. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the killer struck again. Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old widow, was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Like Polly, she was struggling to make ends meet, selling small items and doing sex work to survive. The mutilations were even more severe. Her uterus and parts of her bladder had been removed from her body. The city began to realize this wasn't just any murderer. This was a monster with a chilling, methodical madness. The night of September 30th became known as the double event. In a single hour, the Ripper claimed 2 more lives. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old Swedish immigrant. Her body was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. Her throat was cut, but there were no other injuries. It's widely believed the killer was interrupted. Undeterred, he moved on. Less than an hour later, and barely a mile away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. She was 46, and like the others, had fallen on hard times. The killer had subjected her to unimaginable brutality, mutilating her face and removing her left kidney and a part of her womb. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, represents the terrifying peak of the Ripper's savagery. At only 25, she was the youngest of the 5. Unlike the others, she was murdered indoors, in her small room at 13 Miller's Court. This gave the killer privacy and time. What police discovered on the morning of November 9th was a scene of unbelievable carnage. Her body had been so extensively mutilated she was barely recognizable. The story of these women is a tragic one, made even worse by how their personal histories were often ignored by journalists who reflected the deep class prejudices of the era. With the body count rising and public terror at a fever pitch, London's Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police were under immense pressure. But they were fighting a war in the dark with primitive tools. The investigation was crippled by the lack of modern forensic techniques. Fingerprinting wouldn't be used to secure a murder conviction until 1905, and DNA analysis was pure science fiction. Blood at the scene was just blood. It couldn't be typed or traced. Investigators were left with little more than eyewitness accounts, which were often contradictory and unreliable in the dimly lit, confusing streets of Whitechapel. The police were swamped. They received over 1,400 letters related to the case, most of them useless pranks, yet each one had to be investigated, draining precious time and resources. To make matters worse, crucial records have been lost to time. A key file listing individuals questioned by police went missing, and other vital documents were destroyed in bombing raids during World War II. Despite interviewing over 2,000 people and detaining hundreds, the police net always came up empty. The killer was like a ghost, appearing to do his gruesome work before vanishing back into the fog-shrouded alleys. While the police struggled, the press thrived. The Jack the Ripper case happened at the same time as the rise of cheap, sensational newspapers known as the penny press. They competed for readers with shocking headlines and graphic details. Between August and October 1888, advertising space in some papers exploded as they cashed in on the public's morbid curiosity. In late September, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. Written in red ink, it taunted the police and was signed with a name that would become infamous, Jack the Ripper. Most researchers now believe this letter was a hoax, likely cooked up by a journalist to boost newspaper sales. But whether it was real or not, the name stuck. It created one of the most recognizable and enduring killer pseudonyms in history, transforming a murderer into a terrifying brand. This media frenzy created a paradox. Newspapers claimed they were helping by alerting the public and scrutinizing the police, but by printing every rumor and theory, they may have actually helped the killer evade capture by revealing what the police were thinking. The media created a celebrity out of a monster, a phenomenon that has tragically continued to this day. For over 130 years, investigators and amateur detectives have tried to put a face to the shadow. More than 100 people have been named as suspects, but the evidence against all of them is purely circumstantial. Among the most cited is Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher whose body was found drowned in the Thames in December 1888, shortly after the final canonical murder. The timing of his death is suspicious, but there's no solid evidence linking him to the crimes. Then there's Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He suffered from severe mental illness and reportedly had a deep hatred of women. In 2014, an author claimed to have DNA evidence from a shawl supposedly found near Catherine Eddowes' body that linked Kosminski to the crime. This claim is fiercely disputed. The shawl was never officially recorded as being at the crime scene, and the DNA analysis has been heavily criticized by scientists for its methods and the risk of contamination. Other notable suspects include Michael Ostrog, a Russian con man, and Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was in Whitechapel at the time. Theories have even pointed to members of the royal family, but these have been thoroughly debunked. The simple, frustrating truth is that if any of these men were tried in court today, it's highly unlikely any would be convicted. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains as elusive as it was in 1888. The murders left a permanent scar on society, but the case also became a strange catalyst for change. Social reformers used the intense media coverage to shine a light on the horrific living conditions in the East End. The crimes came to personify everything wrong with Victorian London, inadvertently pushing forward reforms in housing, public health, and policing into the 20th century. But the most profound legacy of Jack the Ripper is the mystery itself. The case remains a force in popular culture precisely because it's both terrifying and unresolved. The killer was never caught, his motives never known, his identity lost to history. This void has been filled by countless books, films, and TV shows, each offering its own theory. Jack the Ripper represents the ultimate cold case, a chilling story of how social anxiety, media sensationalism, and a killer's cruelty can create a myth that lasts forever. The fog may have long since lifted from the streets of Victorian London, but the shadow of Jack the Ripper remains. He was a product of his time, a monster born from the poverty and darkness of Whitechapel. The investigation to catch him pushed the limits of police work, even as it was held back by the technology of the era. But in the end, the story truly belongs to the women whose lives he stole: Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane. They were daughters, wives, and mothers whose humanity has been too often overshadowed by the legend of their killer. Jack the Ripper was never brought to justice, leaving us with one chilling, eternal question: who was he? And maybe that's the most unsettling part of this story. Not the brutality, not the mystery, but the silence that followed. No final clue, no courtroom ending, no moment where the truth finally came to light. Just a killer who stepped out of the fog and then vanished back into it. More than a century later, the streets of Whitechapel are brighter, the gas lamps are gone, the city has moved on, but the questions never did. Because somewhere in the space between history and legend, Jack the Ripper still has no face, and maybe he always will. If you found this story disturbing, fascinating, or unforgettable, you're not alone. These are the cases that stay with you, the ones history never fully explains. If you want more deep dives into the darkest unsolved mysteries, make sure you're subscribed. And if you have a theory, who do you think Jack the Ripper really was? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that never end. Thanks for watching.